Hi, today I'd like to talk to you about two systems which work well together and are kind of like twin brothers in a way. They're basically structurally the same and very similar personalities, although when you know them well, they're just a little bit different. They both have different strengths and different weaknesses. They're called the London system and the Torre system, or the Torre attack. Now, as I usually go on about this quite a lot, there's two sorts of openings. There's opening variations, where you have to know every move pretty importantly because of specific lines. So variations of the King's Indian or the Sicilian tend to be opening variations, whereas opening systems are setups where you play roughly the same moves against any type of setup that your opponent might adopt. So the London and the Torre are two such systems. You play them the move order slightly differently depending on what your opponent does, but essentially you're still playing the same moves against most type of setups. So we'll switch to the board and we'll have a look at how this starts off. The first, these systems are also very good for people who don't have a lot of time to spend on their chess. People who really just don't have time to analyse opening theory. They start off with d4 and they continue with knight f3 is the next move, and then the Torre attack is bishop g5, the London system is bishop f4. So two very similar systems, but which do have some quite different nuances involved. Now, these systems are not only good for people who don't want to learn anything else or can't be bothered learning anything else, they can actually be quite a helpful little thing in your repertoire, which you might pull out occasionally, maybe once every 10 games. So, for example, if you're a d4 player anyway, and after knight f6 you normally play c4, and then against e6 you might play the knight f3 lines rather than taking on the Nimzo Indian, or against the King's Indian you may play knight f3 lines such as g3. It could be useful to have in your repertoire, because after d4, knight f6, knight f3 first before c4, against g6 you can always still go back into a c4 system, or you can unleash the Torre or the London. And so, for example, you may not want to do it against g6, you might want to do this, but maybe against d5 you could produce the Torre or the London. So I'll show you the main moves of it. d4, knight f3, bishop f4 or g5, whichever one you play, e3, bishop d3, usually castles kingside, although this isn't always obligatory, knight b d2, c3. So again, we've got that Caro-Kann type V pawn structure, which you may recognise with black. And here's where things start getting a little bit hazy depending on black's position. Queen will often develop itself to here, ready to push for e4. Sometimes it even develops here, but it all depends on what black is actually doing. Generally find e2 is generally the better spot. Now, I'll go through a couple of black setups. d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, bishop g5 or f4, e6. This is the most common setup for black, although I really do believe it's far from the best. Essentially, black gets this bad bishop, and you may, if you've seen my video about good and bad pieces, you may recognise the pawn structure from this. e6, e3, bishop e7, bishop d3, castles, which they say is a mistake actually. Tigran Petrosian, the former world champion, once played a beautiful game with black here, but he actually castled queenside. This was in a world championship match against Boris Spassky. Although it was interesting, Petrosian himself played this system for white. So interesting stuff. Castles, c5, and particularly after c5, this is when you need to play c3. If they ever capture, you capture this way, and you have open lines for your pieces ready to storm into the position. Um, Knight here, bishop, knight bd2. The b6 is usually how black will develop the bishop. And now, a very strong move here for white. Knight e5. And the idea is if black decides to double white's pawns, white now swaps off the bad bishop for black's good bishop, and then plays f4. And you have a very thematic type mating attack here, involving, or you can start off with knight f3, but often involve queen h5, queen h6, followed by rook f3, rook h3, and you're usually going to find a checkmate somehow or another, particularly with knight f3, knight g5 coming in. You know, black may defend one way, but then it's hard to stop knight f3, knight g5 as well. If somehow or another black does survive this, and particularly if black does survive, the endgame is actually not bad for white, despite the doubled pawns. It's amazing how often black plays this move, in which case you simply just dump the knight into d4 and it's a very, very strong outpost. If black doesn't make that error, white can always dissolve the doubled pawns this way at the right time, of course. You don't need to do it early. But the other point is, though, that they're not even necessarily worth dissolving at any time soon. They're not a weakness, they're actually quite a strength here. If you can get any sort of endgame here where you've swapped this bishop for this knight will beat the bishop in most of these sorts of endgames, simply because the bishop's such a bad piece here. So this is the first major, I suppose, setup that black can adopt. I'll go to the other main one, and that's more of a King's Indian type setup for black. Now, I believe the King's Indian setup is actually probably a better choice for black, although I realise it doesn't suit everybody. d4, knight f3, knight f6, knight f3, g6. And in these type of setups, again, you play roughly the same moves. Specifically in the Torre, you can use this move order, threatening e4. And it almost sort of forces black to do this first. Then you'll just do your main Torre moves, like this. But I'll just for practical purposes, I'll play e3 because I'd like to just show some simple systems here. Bishop here. Black's plan now, essentially, it's going to be hard for black to play their main King's Indian type plan, but black does have some options. One is to play a variation with b6 here and then do this sort of thing, and then at the right time try this. Another plan which I suppose works more against the London than the Torre is knight here, queen here, and push for e5. Now, this plan seems to be fairly sensible. A useful thing to know if you're using the London move order against the King's Indian setups is play this move h3. It stops this knight move because your bishop has a hidey hole here, and this bishop can actually be a real pest in something like the London. I've played the London in some Melbourne Chess Club Blitz marathons and simply got this type of position and just thrown this a-pawn down the board. And at some point, once it gets to here, it really stifles black's development. It's a useful sort of plan to know if you're a bit stuck for a plan in a position. Just a4, a5. You've developed all your other pieces relatively sensibly, whether the queen be here or here. Kind of useful to know about this plan. You can't really talk about the London though without mentioning the London bishop and London rook. So I'll just show you what those are. And so this is specific to the London rather than the Torre. The London bishop is essentially this bishop sitting on f4. I suppose you could call it the Torre bishop in its twin brother system. But the main idea of the London bishop is it can be swapped off to get a situation called the London rook, and that's when the knight plays to this square and the bishop ends up here. the bishop controls a very nasty diagonal in the London, and you can often play it in after playing c3 at the right time. You can often push c4 and it becomes a bit more Queen's Gambit-esque. And particularly when the pawn gets to this square, this London bishop is really a nuisance of a piece. But when it gets swapped off, you get what we call a London rook. And so you've castled kingside, the things are starting to get quite hairy around your king. You often might have to create a weakness such as this. And the London rook can be just as damaging as the London bishop. Once again, these two systems are not by any means forced wins, and they're not even really necessarily going to lead for a big or to any advantage at all for white. I mean, if you want to become a 2600 grandmaster, you cannot base your repertoire around the London or the Torre. But they're useful things to throw into your repertoire to use occasionally. If you want to become very strong, you need to play main lines. But if you're a club player and you're playing against other club players or 2000 type players, the London and the Torre are very useful weapons to have in your arsenal. Hopefully you enjoy them and enjoy playing them. Thank you.